I'm an EMT, specifically a critical care EMT. I work for a big hospital system in my state. The difference between a normal ambulance and my ambulance is that we ride with sometimes two EMTs and a nurse on our truck. That is flight certified and all that stuff. And we only really do the critical of critical cases. So if someone's in the ICU and they're on a ventilator or they're on like bypass or something and they have multiple medications running, we're the ones that hospitals call to transfer them to other hospitals so that they can receive a higher level of care.
Mm.
Like we go into New York City for people that need heart transplants and all sorts of things.
Damn.
Um, so we also do 911 in between the um the critical care jobs that we do. I In addition to doing that, I used to volunteer for a fire department for a town, and at the same time I also volunteered for another first aid squad. So I was doing like three jobs and only two of them were non-paid, one was paid. Um Within, I want to say, my years ago, within having my certification for only maybe about like 3 or 4 months, um let's just say like I had squeezed almost 30 years of experience, I was told, into a 3 year span. That was many, many years ago. But I've been very lucky. I've had mentors that have trained me. And I guess the only thing I could say is I only got as much experience as I did because I exposed myself to it. Um, but there's one particular thing that I think about almost daily is this was my first call. It was a 911 call with the one first aid squad, which was volunteer, that I joined. We got called for a guy, right? He's in his 40s. He's like 41, and he passed out at home. And we showed up, and I had a junior with me who was not even 18 yet. So he's like a cadet, and he's trying to feel it out and see if this is what he wants to do. He's like my personal helper. And I had another EMT with me who was going to be driving. So I decided, you know what, I'll take point on this case. And we get to this guy's house. He's awake. And his wife is like, you need to go to the hospital. And he's like, I'm fine. I'm fine. And his two kids are like, Dad, just go to the hospital. So we're like, okay. He gets up off the couch. He's fine. Like, he seems great to me. His blood pressure's awesome. His heart rate is great. His oxygen is great. Like, he had no pain or anything. He just can't figure out why he suddenly passed out. So we're on our way to the hospital, and protocol is that you call the ER, right? And you tell them, hey, we're going to be there in 5 minutes, 10 minutes. We got this guy. This is what's going on. This is why we picked him up, and this is how he's doing. And he was doing fantastic. We were about 5 or 6 minutes away from the hospital. And I hang up the phone and I sit down on the bench in the back and I start talking to the guy. Like, we're talking about everything. His kids are going to high school, going into high school, cars, like whatever. And then out of nowhere, he looks at me and he says, I'm having a little trouble catching my breath. And I'm like, okay. So I give him a little oxygen. And about another minute goes by and he says, I have this sudden pain in my chest and my lower gut. And I'm like, okay, man, like, how bad is that pain from 1 to 10, 10 being the worst thing you've ever felt, and like a one being like a tickle? And he says, I don't know, it's like a 4 or a 5. And then his eyes roll in the back of his head and he just goes limp.
Oof.
And I'm like rubbing on his chest like you're supposed to, right on to the center of his chest to try to wake him up because it doesn't feel good, right? It's supposed to wake you up. And for the law's sake, I'm gonna name this guy Jim because I can't use his real name. So I'm like, Jim, wake up, buddy, wake up. And I'm just like, trying to wake him up. And I check for a pulse right here on his carotid, on his neck, and I'm like, I don't feel a pulse. And I look at my junior partner and I said, hey man, it's game time. We got to do this. So I throw the stretcher back. I'm like, start doing compressions and start doing CPR. I'm gonna get the defibrillator ready and everything. And the worst part of this is his wife rode with us to the hospital in the ambulance. She was in the front seat. and she was constantly looking back into the cabin, into the back of the ambulance to see how things were going, right? And the second she heard me say, "I'm starting CPR," she screamed. And I don't blame her, because it's like her husband, So my junior cadet is doing chest compressions. He's like stressed out of his mind because this is his first run ever, and we get the AED on, we're bagging him, which is giving him forced oxygen, squeezing a bag, right? Like you usually see it on Chicago Fire or whatever. And the AED every, so often will be like stop compressions, checking for a readable pulse. Let's see if we need to do shocks. And I shocked this guy probably about 2 or 3 times before we got to the hospital. And we backed up to the ER and we're panicking. We're racing the stretcher through the ER. And the doctor comes walking over and he says, "What's the problem? You just called like 7 or 8 minutes ago and said this guy was fine." And I'm hanging off the side of the stretcher, riding on the bar, so I don't have to walk with the stretcher, and I'm pumping on his chest. And I'm like, "Well, doc, he decided to take a turn before we got there." And we get rushed into a room. We have a whole team of people. We're pushing epinephrine. We're shocking. We're doing everything. And I notice his stomach is getting firmer and firmer and firmer the more we're working on him, which is an indication that he may have had an abdominal aortic aneurysm, which is a AAA. It's what happens when the vessels and the artery kind of balloons outward because there's too much pressure over time,
Yeah.
and then it pops, and you just leak. You just leak everywhere internally. And we all kind of, like the nurses, the doctor, like we all kind of looked at each other and we knew, this wasn't going to work. And my biggest concern was walking out of that room back to my ambulance to clean up and having to pass his wife, who was told to sit in a chair by the exit door. And I was terrified to pass her because she trusted me, to like help her husband. And I know there was nothing we could do. Like, this guy died. We did an ultrasound and we discovered that he just had a lot of damage from this aneurysm. There was nothing anybody could do. He was going to go. It was his time. But it was so sudden. Like, I was the last person this guy saw before he left. And nobody should ever have to see that, especially my ugly mug. But the worst thing was I walked out past his wife and I had to say I'm sorry. I thought she was going to be so angry with me. And I think about that like every day. But flash forward about a year or two, there's something called the Relay for Life, right? It's like a cancer run that people do. They pledge how many laps they want to walk and stuff. And I was doing ambulance standby for that in case anybody gets dehydrated, they fall down, get hurt, whatever. And I'm looking at my phone and I'm just doing stuff, watching YouTube, and this woman comes up and she's like blocking out the sun, and she goes, "Do you remember me?" And I look up and it's his wife. And I'm like, oh my God, like how could I forget? Turned out my guy was also a recovering cancer patient. And she walks every year in his honor. And I guess word got around that because it's a small town that I used to live in, word got around that I felt guilty and I felt like I failed, and she looked at me and she's like, "You did everything you could and you did awesome." But I still think about that guy every day, because his kids are out of high school at this point, and they have to grow up with, finish their lives without their father. And that just hurts big time. So, but like I had nightmares about it for months. And whenever I'm at work and I have downtime and we're not doing anything, or we're just driving from one location to another. Like, I go back and I think about that, and I have dozens and dozens and dozens of other related stories like this, but he pops back into my mind a lot, among other people, but he pops back into my mind a lot. So I don't know. Part of me knows that I did everything I could, but part of me also feels like there was something else I could have done, you know, even though I know there was nothing else I could have done.
Tell me a story, I wanna hear it. You might think it's boring, but I'm interested.